Ladies and gentlemen, the last speaker in this year's Chaos is Emily Cross from Bangor. Emily.
Great. Thank you very much, Mel. And just like each of the speakers before me, I'd like to thank the organizers and especially Marius Palin for the outstanding just running of this entire meeting. It has been such a pleasure to be here from start to finish. And I have to also say that a note to all of the students in the audience, the very first time I attended Chaos was as a PhD student in 2008, and I remember presenting my poster at the Art Museum in the outside atrium across the way there. Some nods, some people were there as well, and it was fantastic. That meeting really inspired me. I've been back once since then, and it's a pleasure to be back this year as a speaker. So, in the previous talk we had this morning, Peter kind of took us through some lower level basics of action and vision and how these two things come together. And as you might have guessed from my opening slide here, we're going to be taking this much farther, higher level and thinking about how we perceive and produce actions that are much more complex and involve the entire body. So, I'll begin my presentation by placing my research questions in a much broader context. Indeed, for concepts, actions, and objects, I'm right in the middle there with actions. That's what interests me the most. And I think it's something that should interest all of us, because if we think about our daily lives, what are we doing? We are interacting with our environment by moving through it, by seeing other people move through it, and by coordinating our actions seamlessly with other people to achieve endless goals. So we can think about really simple, trivial, everyday type of actions, such as raising your hand in this talk to ask a question, or accepting an espresso from the barista when you're at the local cafe, to far more complex actions, such as what it might take to build a house with someone else, play a game of football, or perform a dance on stage. So complex actions really span this spectrum from the ones that are very complex but we perform every day to those that are much more involved and intricate and take a lot of coordination. And kind of the big question that interests me is, how are we able to make sense of other people moving around us and coordinate our actions with others to achieve these endless goals? So this question has interested venerable thinkers for decades, if not millennia. And the basic idea that was kind of first proposed by Aristotle, then Descartes elaborated upon it further, and then with the birth of modern psychology and now cognitive neuroscience, there's this idea that we're able to understand how others are moving around us in this complex social world via these action resonance or mirroring processes. So basically, if you see, it's kind of hard to see with the resolution, but that's Chubby Checker and his friends up there doing the twist. And the idea is that you understand what these chaps are doing when they're moving their body just like that, because you can imagine what it would be like, or you might have performed those same actions yourself before, and you can use your prior motor information, this prior motor template, to make sense of what others are doing around you. Now, watch the word automatically there, because of course this is not a conscious process. This isn't something that we're effortfully engaging in. So when we see someone move towards us or extend a hand, we're not thinking, if I was doing that, I'd be trying to shake someone's hand. These are things that are just happening at an implicit, automatic level. So what I'm trying to do with my research is take this kind of action resonance idea as a point of departure. And there's this idea, basically, that we have perceptual analysis. This is a very, very simple box and arrow diagram. Perceptual analysis on one side, and we have action understanding and motor output on the other. And yes, these two things are related. So we see someone performing an action, and essentially, what's going on is motor resonance. We kind of play that action through in our head. And what the past now decade and a half, nearly 2 decades of research have given rise to is this notion of an action observation network. Now, many of you in the audience might be more familiar with I will call it the predecessor to the action observation network, the mirror neuron system, or the human mirror system. And indeed, as you'll see, the usual suspects of the human mirror system, the ventral premotor cortex and the inferior parietal lobule, are also very much part of the action observation network. But Scott Grafton and others, we have liked to extend the conceptualization of the mirror system to also include more occipitotemporal regions that are really engaged in biological motion perception when we're watching complex actions that others are performing around us. So to kind of be a bit more agnostic about the mirror system, we prefer the language, the action observation network. And what I've tried to do with my research throughout the past decade or so is really ask questions about what's going on here when we apply different kinds of experience. So in our daily lives, we are constantly being shaped by experience. And the types of experience I've looked at throughout many different studies in the past include physical experience, visual experience, linguistic experience, auditory, social, and aesthetic or affective experience. So there's lots of different ways we can kind of try to manipulate how this link between action and perception might take place and how the action observation network might be influenced by these different types of experience. And I, for one, find this incredibly fascinating. But some of you might harken back to the final talk we had on Friday by a certain person in this audience who shall remain nameless, but not faceless, who told us that experience only modulates at the margins. And while he might not have been talking about, the exact types of experience I'm talking about per se, I would like to argue that perhaps it's only the margins at which experience modulates, but it's extremely interesting to ask what experience can do and how it can shape this relationship. So if we're thinking about how experience is going to shape perception, there's two kind of sets of theoretical models that can help guide our investigations. And the first one stems from developmental psychology, and it's a very, I like it because it's a very broad brushstrokes theory, but it's also not incredibly specified. And this is called the like-me hypothesis, or the like-me theory. And Andrew Meltzoff was the first to propose this theory, and he suggested that understanding the basic similarity between me and you, between self and others, it forms the foundation for social cognition. So kind of, hearkening back to this idea that we use our own experience to make sense of others around us, I can understand what you're doing by using myself as a template, and the more similar you are to me, the more I will understand you. So this idea of Meltzoff fits very well with this notion that actions performed by self and others are stored in common codes. This is Wolfgang Prinz's big contribution to the cognitive psychology literature of common codes between action perception and action production. And this is a simple theoretical notion, but it's very powerful, and it also seems to be supported by a lot of empirical data. So there's been myriad studies that have perhaps not set out to test this theoretical question per se, but certainly lend support to it. And that includes work by Bettini and colleagues where they had participants watch either a human, a monkey, or a dog performing different types of actions, such as biting a piece of food. And essentially what they find is that while people were being scanned in fMRI, what they find is that when you're watching a person biting a piece of food, you get widespread engagement of the action observation network. You get less engagement when you see a monkey, which is kind of like me, but not very like me, performing those actions, and even less engagement, as you can see here, when a dog, who is even less like me, is performing those actions. So kind of a nice linear trend of the more like me, the more engagement of the AON. There's also some nice work by Tai and colleagues and several others who look at the how people perceive actions being performed by humans versus artificial agents or robots. So in this case, they showed human hands making reaching and grasping actions and robotic hands making the same actions. And what they find is that part of the left inferior frontal gyrus responds much more robustly to seeing human hands, which are like me, compared to robotic hands, which are not very much like me. And finally, some more evidence was performed by my colleagues and I during my PhD, where we looked at expert dancers who were watching choreography that they'd spent weeks rehearsing compared to kinematically similar choreography that they'd never learned before. And what we can see is really nice widespread engagement bilaterally of the action observation network when our experienced dancers are watching movements that they've embodied, that they've practiced, that they're really adept at performing, compared to similar movements that they've never actually tried on their own bodies before. So lots and lots of evidence that supports this kind of simple but nice notion that we're hardwired to seek out self-other equivalences in our environment. So, it's a dominant viewpoint. There is lots of evidence to support it that the action observation network, it assumes a matching process that is biased towards other agents and actions that look and move like me. And again, we can think of lots of examples in our daily lives, whether it's someone playing basketball, just walking, or having a boogie where, yes, we can, they're like me, I can kind of do all of those things. But of course, also in our daily lives, there are lots of situations where we see agents or actions doing things that are extremely unlike me. So whether that's an Olympic figure skater, a break dancer, a modern dancer, or someone who's running on artificial limbs, I think for most of us, we could agree that those agents and actions are moving in a way that is not at all like me, and yet we have very little problem understanding, kind of making sense of these people's movements. So we can start to ask a question about, okay, well, if the action observation network is hardwired to respond most to like me, how flexible and adaptable is this network? How does it respond to viewing actions or perhaps even agents that are much less familiar and much less like me? And I think to begin to address this question, we have to kind of take a step up in theoretical models, and I think that if we turn to the predictive coding model, this can allow us to form much more specific predictions about how these kind of differences in familiarity or like-me-ness might shape engagement of the action observation network. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the predictive coding model, really nice, simple, elegant model, which actually builds upon some of the internal models that Peter spoke about in the previous talk. And essentially, what this model supposes is that visual input is entering the action observation network, of course, from the more posterior occipitotemporal regions. And when you're seeing an action that's familiar, that you have experience with, that's like me, information is going to proceed via this top-down or forward model where it kind of proceeds from more frontal regions back to parietal and finally back to the occipitotemporal regions. And our prior motor experience is going to enable us to have accurate predictions of ongoing actions. So we're generating those predictions kind of in more frontal regions, and they're feeding backwards to more visual regions to kind of check, does our expectation sync up with what visually is coming into the system? So top-down model for more familiar actions, and we can talk about a bottom-up model when we're seeing actions or agents that are much less familiar. So if you go to Cirque du Soleil and you see these acrobats performing all sorts of crazy contortions, the idea is you certainly don't have many predictions for how those actions are going to unfold in real time, but your brain is really using this visual information as it comes in, and you're able to, the brain is able to feed that forward from more posterior to anterior regions to build up in a bottom-up way kind of a representation of this kind of more unusual or less familiar or very much unlike me action. And again, lots of people have written about this. James Kilner's conceptualization is the one that we tend to look at the most in our laboratory, but there have been quite a few others who've kind of conceptualized predictive coding in this way. So to kind of look at these questions about how experience and familiarity might shape the action observation network according to this like-me hypothesis and the predictive coding model, I'm going to focus on 3 studies in particular today that allow us to kind of take apart different aspects of these theoretical models. The first study I'll tell you about allows us to ask a question about how purely visual experience might influence how we perceive and predict complex actions. Then we'll turn our focus to look at how lack of experience with an agent or an action might engage activity within the action observation network. And finally, we'll turn to some effective connectivity analyses to really start to test this predictive coding model in more depth to see if we might be able to provide support for how fluctuations in like-me-ness or familiarity shape this network. Right, so on to the first study, how purely visual experience shapes how we perceive and predict actions, not just normal actions. Again, we're going to look at really complex actions throughout this talk. These are actions that our participants could not possibly perform with their own bodies. So our objective here, again, to repeat this really dominant viewpoint because there is so much support for it in the literature, it's absolutely the case that physical experience, it shapes perception, and this is shown by changes in sensory motor, cortical engagement when you're observing others in actions. This is very much the like-me hypothesis. When you kind of perform something and are really physically adept at doing it, then you see it, your sensory motor cortices are going to be markedly changed. Usually it's an increase in activation, but we could certainly talk about why it sometimes decreases. However, it's much less clear how visual experience alone for actions that observers cannot perform might shape brain and behavior when you're watching others in action. So in this study, we're going to use an action prediction task to quantify the impact of visual experience on action perception. So we have 2 major questions that we're going to try to get at here. And the first concerns whether sensory motor predictive mechanisms might be so broad that they enable us to generalize to actions that are physically impossible to perform. Alternatively, it could be the case that the action observation network is very much sculpted by our own experience and kind of evolutionary experience, and it's only those actions that are performed by conspecifics that are familiar and executable to us that's going to engage this network. And the other question we want to ask is how extensive visual experience changes the neural substrates of complex action perception for different types of agents that we might see. So we can generate two hypotheses from the theories that have come before. And the first is that if sensory motor predictive mechanisms are able to generalize to non-executable actions, so somewhat like the ones that I showed you in a previous slide, then it should be the case that we see broad engagement of the sensory motor core nodes of the action observation network when we predict non-executable actions. And this idea really comes from work by Ricardo Schubitz and colleagues, who talks about parts of the sensory motor cortices really being super generalizable, and they're able to predict all sorts of actions that there's no way we can map onto our bodies, such as a dragonfly's wings or waterfalls kind of coming down the side of a mountain. So this is all movement, this is all action in a sense, but it's not stuff that we can readily represent with our own bodies. And yet she argues quite convincingly that we see sensory motor engagement that supports these really abstract predictions as well. An alternative prediction is that if sensory motor predictive mechanisms are shaped and bound by an observer's experience or body or abilities, then we should see much less or no engagement of the action observation network when you're predicting and perceiving these non-executable actions, or at least not within sensory motor regions. And this is an idea that Rebecca Sachs and her colleagues have kind of presented some work to show that if bodies are involved, yes, you're going to be using sensory motor cortices, but if objects or things that we cannot map onto our own bodies are going to be moving through space, it's going to be much earlier visual regions, not necessarily those regions we associate with the action observation network that are engaged. So this was a training study that we undertook here, and in this training study we had identical fMRI sessions on the first and last testing days, and in between we had 4 identical training sessions. And during our training sessions, participants were exposed to 2 different types of stimuli. So as I said, we had actions that our participants couldn't perform with their own bodies, and these included 2 different types of agents. So we had human biological motion, which you can see here, and our humans were very adept rhythmic gymnasts who were training for the German Olympic team. They were very young. They're like 12, 13-year-old gymnasts who were kind of in pre-training for the Olympics, and they were extremely flexible and able to do things that none of our participants could actually do with their own bodies. And we also had some kind of very interesting, erratically moving wind-up toys, so other things that can move through space, but again, participants can't map onto their own bodies. And then we had 2 levels of perceptual experience. We had those that participants came into the laboratory and spent a lot of time watching day after day for the 4 days of training. And then we had a similar subset that they never had visual training on. And to give you an idea of what some of these videos look like, these are the undoctored versions of the videos. As you can see, not many of us, I think, can perform actions quite like that. So that was one of our gymnastic sequences, and this is one of our wind-up toy sequences. And yes, both videos always feature, or sorry, both classes of videos always feature agents moving across the screen from left to right. But it's not super linear, smooth motion. Even our wind-up toys kind of skittered and moved in slightly strange ways, and same with our gymnasts. It wasn't a super obvious, easy line of movement that was necessarily straightforward to predict if you weren't at least visually very familiar with it. And while our participants were being trained, they didn't just watch these videos. They had a prediction training task where they received feedback. So they saw the gymnast or one of the wind-up toys moving across the space, and then they disappear behind a black occluder, which was always on the screen. And their task was to press a button when they thought that the gymnast or toy should reappear from behind the occluder and keep moving. And then when they pressed the button, the videos were doctored so that the agent did come out and move along. So they'd have a bit of visual feedback as to whether that seemed like it was right. And then they'd also receive actual feedback including a smiley face, and how big the smile was indicated with a millisecond precision how close they were to with their prediction. And they had a hare if they were too fast with their prediction, and a tortoise if they were too slow. And these feedback windows became more and more precise as the 4 days of training went on. And what we can see behaviorally, it's always nice to make sure our manipulation works, is that in the first day, when participants were in the scanner and performing this exact same prediction task, I should say that they didn't get feedback in the scanner, but they performed the same prediction task, that our participants were really quite slow with their predictions. So to orient you to this figure here, on the y-axis we have the mean deviation from the actual point of reemergence. So if you have values that are above the x-axis, that means you're too slow in your prediction, and if you have values that are below the x-axis, that means you're too fast with your prediction. And then along the x-axis here we have our testing days, so the first scan, the training, and then the final scan. And you see that on the first day of scanning, they're really slow with their predictions. They're quite poor, almost a second off, in fact, for the wind-up toys. But then really quickly, once they start getting feedback, their predictions become much more accurate as to when these agents should reappear. And importantly, what we see is that by the second day of scanning, there's actually no difference between the trained and the untrained sequences. So we get a lot of generalization. Even though they only received feedback on the sequences here, and never these ones, this kind of feedback training process really generalized as well. And what's interesting about this is that if we do start to look at differences between how they're perceiving trained and untrained actions, we know that these differences are unlikely due to differences in response time. So we'll just look at, there's lots of findings from this study. I'm just going to focus on two in particular. And the first concerns what's going on when our participants are perceiving these complex actions compared to prediction. And the reminder is just that during perception, there's actually something, there's actually an agent moving across the screen. There's movement on the screen. And during prediction, yes, there's perception involved, but it's a static image. There's nothing moving during the prediction part. It's just kind of being played in participants' heads. And what we see here is that, just focusing in on some of the results from the perception greater than prediction contrast, we see that, yes, there are visual regions that are much more engaged when you're perceiving these actions compared to when there's nothing moving on the screen. That's not terribly surprising, but we don't see a lot of sensory motor cortical activity when participants are perceiving compared to predicting, which is quite interesting because agents are moving, but the brain's not really responding within the action observation network. However, when participants are predicting compared to perceiving, here we see much broader, much more robust engagement of the action observation network, particularly in bilateral IPL. So we know that there's nothing going on in terms of movement on the screen, but participants kind of playing through, simulating these actions, whether it's the wind-up toys or the gymnast. It's kind of collapsed across all of our different agents and actions and trainings here. We see that prediction is involving much more action observation network within these parietal sensory motor cortices. So to move on to, again, just to really focus in on some of our simple effects of training here, I think these two are potentially the most interesting findings. If we look at what's going on in the brain when our participants are predicting untrained compared to trained gymnastic sequences, so remember their behavioral performance, they're able to predict them with equal accuracy, but they've spent a week on the trained ones and not trained on the untrained ones at all. Here we see that there's bilateral occipital temporal regions that are coming online, as well as the superior parietal lobule, and we argue that this is to support equivalent performance for these untrained sequences, which is really quite interesting. Likewise, sorry, this is a little hard to read, but when our participants are predicting the untrained compared to the trained wind-up toy sequences, we see more engagement of the lateral occipital complex, which is kind of, again, helping to support this equivalent performance for these unfamiliar actions. So, you know, we're not going to call this extra striate body area here for the gymnast because we didn't do a localizer, and I know especially with this crowd that it's, you know, death to talk about EBA without localizing it properly, but we do have human bodies moving across the screen, and this area of occipital temporal cortex does correspond quite closely to what's been localized as EBA in other studies. And then interestingly, we have this more object-related processing region that's supporting equivalent prediction for the wind-up toy sequences. So we see these regions kind of coming online to help support prediction. So what we can conclude from this study in terms of how we can predict actions we cannot perform that we might be quite visually familiar with is that we get stronger IPL and as well as other sensory motor parts of the action observation network when we're predicting compared to perceiving. So this appears to be some sort of general effect. It's not influenced by agent, it's not influenced by training, and I would say that this comes much more in line with Schubitz's theory of sensory motor cortices subserving prediction across a really broad range of tasks. If we ask how visual experience via training might shape action observation network engagement, we see that it reduces demand on neural resources to predict the familiar compared to unfamiliar. So we see more engagement for unfamiliar. And we see that higher level visual regions that we might argue are associated with body or object processing, they're the ones that are equivalent, contributing to this equivalent behavioral performance for making these predictions of these actions that we can't map onto our own bodies. So we'd like to say, even though we're not testing it super directly, but we'd still argue that this data is consistent with the predictive coding model where the sensory motor regions are receiving the dominant inputs from visual processing regions in the occipitotemporal cortex. So we see when you are looking at these actions that you don't have as much experience predicting, you're really going to be driving that early visual region in the action observation network to support this prediction. So on to the next study, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and instead of using a training manipulation to look at how like me or not like me-ness is represented in the action observation network, we're going to determine that via our stimuli themselves. So we're going to ask how form and motion cues of agents or actions that are decidedly not like me compared to those that are more like me might shape engagement of the action observation network. So again, yes, the dominant model of the action observation network, of these sensory motor cortices, is that they're very much shaped to respond most to agents and actions that are like me. However, even though there's lots and lots of evidence in support of this, kind of for the past nearly 10 years, bit by bit, more evidence is trickling out to suggest that, hang on, it's not always that straightforward or that simple. There's been a few studies that have been published, this really nice one in particular by Gazzola and colleagues, where they looked at human hands versus robotic hands, grabbing all variety of glasses and cups and mugs. And essentially, they don't make a big deal of this in their paper, but they don't see any differences whether it's a human hand or a robotic hand performing that action. And they make a nice conclusion about it's just the goal-directedness of the action. It doesn't matter about the agent, but it is quite interesting that they had these kind of robotic hands doing this robotic motion or human hands doing nice, smooth biological motion, and they don't find any differences. And there's been some other work by my laboratory and others that also start to call into question how strong this like-me notion is. So what we did with this experiment is we tested the limits of the flexibility of the action observation network by varying the familiarity of agent and action cues. And we actually, in this paper, have two brain imaging experiments with separate sets of participants. I'm only going to talk about the second one today in interests of time. So in the second experiment of this study, we had a 2x2 factorial design, and we had two types of agent form and two types of agent motion. So as you can see with form, we have a human form, a nice human dancer here, and we had a Lego robot form. And in terms of motion, we have kind of smooth, natural motion where we just asked our dancer to kind of have a little bit of a groove and move in a certain way. And we also asked him to move in a more rigid, robotic way. This was a very adept professional break dancer from Leipzig, Germany. And then we went to the toy shop and we bought a Lego robot action figure. And I had a fantastic research assistant who did the painstaking work of using stop motion cinematography to match the Lego robot as closely as possible, frame by frame, 25 frames per second, to the human's action. So it was very painstaking work, but I think in the end it worked quite convincingly. So now we're able to look at differences between, of course, human versus robotic form, and then more human versus robotic action. And what we did is we took naive participants who had no experience dancing or doing breakdancing in particular. We brought them into the scanner, and we had them complete this task. So they watched a bunch of these stimuli, like the ones I just showed you, and after 25% of them, a little question probe would appear, and then a 2-second probe video would pop up of just a little snippet of movement, and their task was to decide yes or no, did this probe movement appear in the video, the longer video they'd previously seen. Now the point of this manipulation was not only to make sure our participants were awake, but also to ensure that they weren't paying attention more to the Lego robot, for example, or when the human was moving like a robot. There could be, various types of movement that just capture attention more. But indeed, what we see from the behavioral data is there's no major differences, and they're performing above 90% accuracy for all types of stimuli. So we're pleased to see that. So in terms of what's going on in the brain, first we like to do what I call a sanity check, and we just kind of look at what's going on when you're observing any type of action compared to baseline. So the first thing we're going to look at here is natural movement. So this is the human or the Lego robot moving in this more kind of smooth, natural human way compared to an implicit baseline. And as you would expect, when there's movement compared to nothing, we're seeing widespread engagement of the action observation network bilaterally. And likewise, when we look at the human or the robot moving in a robotic way compared to baseline, we see a very similar pattern. And that's fine. That doesn't go against the like-me hypothesis necessarily, because this is just movement compared to baseline. There's still agents that are moving compared to a blank screen, so we're happy with that. But of course, the much more interesting question is what happens when we compare these types of movement? And if we ask, okay, what's going on in the brain when we see natural compared to robotic movement, according to the like-me hypothesis, we should see much stronger engagement of the action observation network, because this is the type of movement that we use every day, that we have experience with doing, that is like me. Do we see that? Not at all. We see that the action observation network is more or less silent. There's nothing going on there, and instead we just get engagement of these very early, very, very early visual regions back in the occipital lobe. And the inverse contrast, robotic compared to natural movement, here we see widespread engagement of the action observation network bilaterally. This is very robust, and these findings, because I didn't believe them at first, this is why we reran the experiment with a second set of participants, and we also were made very, very sure that this wasn't analyzed backwards, and it's not been. So this obviously goes very much against this like-me hypothesis, and as well as our initial predictions. So we see bilateral AON much more robustly when you see this movement type that's not the way you move normally, that's not the way that your body is used to interacting with the environment. We can also, of course, look at the main effects of agent form. These can also provide us with some interesting insights as to what's going on when you're seeing an agent that's like you compared to an agent that's, an animated plastic toy. And here we see widespread engagement of occipitotemporal regions extending up and along the intraparietal sulcus, and we argue that this pattern of findings is consistent with the notion that there's increased visual processing as well as object processing going on when you're watching this robot compared to the human dancer. What's really interesting, and perhaps a question for discussion, is why when we did the inverse contrast, we actually don't see anything going on in the brain when you look at the human form compared to the robotic form. So that was, again, interesting. Even if we lower the threshold, it seems to be that the robotic agent is capturing much more activity within the AON and more early visual regions. And the final finding I'd like to highlight from this study, of course, concerns the interaction. And the most interesting direction of the interaction, I believe, is what's going on when you're seeing the human move like a human, so this is the expected pairing, and the robot moving like a robot, so also the expected pairing, compared to the human moving like a robot or the robot moving like a human. So we can call this kind of the natural pairings compared to the strange or the unnatural pairings. And what this analysis gives us, not quite cluster corrected, p less than 0.6 cluster corrected, but very close, is that there's a region within the left temporal parietal junction which really seems to be responding. And this is a whole brain analysis. Nothing else shows up from this analysis except for this left TPJ region. And what our parameter estimates are showing us here is that it's a really nice crossover interaction. So the human moving more human-like and the Lego robot moving more robot-like, these are the two conditions that are driving this region more than the human moving like a robot or the robot moving like a human. So this is a really interesting finding. And interestingly as well, with a colleague of mine at the Max Planck Institute, Tobias Grossman, we decided to follow up this study with a group of 4-month-old infants using FNIRS. So we used the exact same stimuli I showed you before, and we had these little tiny babies that have very little visual experience and even less motor experience interacting with their world. And we showed them the same videos. And quite puzzlingly, but interestingly, we see that kind of a set of diodes in the FNIRS array shows a very similar pattern over the left temporal parietal junction, where the human moving like a human and the robot moving like a robot are engaging, these stimuli conditions are engaging this region much more also in the very young infant's brain, which is quite interesting. And then the kind of strange pairings are engaging this region much less. Now, of course, we have to be careful when we're making comparisons between fMRI and fNIRS. These are not the same thing. And what we can say about development and kind of whether we're hardwired to make sense of agents and actions that have consistent versus strange pairings, there's perhaps lots of interesting things to think about there. But to us, that pattern being so similar was really quite striking. So what we can conclude from this second study is that we've demonstrated across 2 independent experiments, just one that I've shown you here, that we get much very robust engagement of the action observation network when you're seeing these actions that are very much unlike me. So these very strange, robotic, rigid actions. These findings, they stand in contrast with the majority of findings throughout this field. Now, it's not every study that has shown this like me pattern, but again, most of the studies do report this like me pattern. And in terms of how we can reconcile this with the like me hypothesis, and this is kind of going to bring us towards the predictive coding, we have 2 possible explanations. One that some of you might have been thinking right away when you saw the stimuli is, hang on, there's lots of really different low-level features between those stimuli. When you see the robotic action, whether performed by the human or robot, there's only kind of one limb moving at any given time, whereas in the more human-like movements, there's lots of degrees of freedom, all the limbs are kind of moving at once, and you're exactly right. There is a lot of differences in the low-level motion features, but we did some analyses to kind of model out mean motion energy, which we use this analysis in all of our studies to make sure that it's not these low-level differences in motion energy that are driving our results. So we don't think that that's the most likely explanation. What we think a much more likely explanation is that when you're seeing these kind of unfamiliar, strange movements, there's greater compensatory or top-down modulation that's engaged when you're trying to kind of make sense of these strange, unusual actions. And this could be underlying increased demands to either learn or predict or otherwise assimilate these atypical actions into your own motor repertoire. And again, we argue that this does fit well with the predictive coding model as outlined by Kilner and colleagues. Now, because there's been so much evidence that shows this really strong linear relationship between, less like me, less engagement, more like me, more engagement of the action observation, and we're showing the opposite here, we also put forward a potential theoretical framing for how the relationship between familiarity and engagement of these sensory motor cortices when we watch others in action might be manifest. And we propose a U-shaped function where if you're seeing actions that are incredibly not like me, you're going to have really strong engagement of this system because your predictions are they're inaccurate and you're trying to build them kind of from very little information. And when you have a lot of experience with an action, you've done it with your own body or you've seen it a million times, you're going to have very precise predictions. And any tiny deviation from your prediction about the action that you see unfolding is also going to drive this system to a much stronger degree. And this is why we might see kind of this dip in the middle. Now, again, this is when we first proposed this in 2012. It was just one way to reconcile our data with previous findings, and there's been a few studies since then by my laboratory and others that are adding more and more data points to these curves, and it seems to be the case that this is perhaps not such a nonsensical representation of what might be going on. So the final study that I will tell you about concerns kind of starting to probe much more deeply into this like me question by using effective connectivity to address the predictive coding model. So we're going to see whether it's possible to move away from magnitude-based bold imaging to looking at effective connectivity analyses. So it's very much the case in a lot of these studies and in this literature that a lot of social perception studies will use these univariate subtraction designs, even though I appreciate at this meeting everyone showed MPPA data. And we have MPPA data too, but I'm not talking about it today. But there is still kind of a dominant, and it's been in the past, that univariate techniques, subtraction designs, are what have been the bread and butter of a lot of social perception research. And particularly looking at these questions about familiarity, if we look at differences between familiar versus unfamiliar, we might see this minus this, we get these brain regions. To date, less is known about how these brain regions might interact. Now, there is, of course, anatomical, functional, and effective connectivity approaches that are starting to tackle this. And I think the effective connectivity approaches, where we can talk about how these regions might dynamically modulate each other, might be a really interesting way forward. And there is growing interest in exploring the dynamic interactions between the main nodes of this network by a bunch of other groups, not just ours. And really, I would say Christian Kaiser's group in Amsterdam has been kind of at the forefront of really pushing this agenda forward. So what we've tried to do in this study is to take this predictive coding model that I introduced earlier in the talk, and then to kind of look at variations in the like-me nature of actions and look at how these might impact AON engagement during perception using dynamic causal modeling. So our hypotheses are that when you observe movements that are perceived as increasingly familiar, if you have this kind of as your baseline model right here, increasingly familiar actions should result in decreased influence coming back from visual regions and moving forward to more parietal and frontal regions, whereas increasingly familiar actions should also result in increased influence from the IFG propagating backwards to IPL and then middle temporal gyrus. And again, we didn't use a training study in this particular one. Instead, we had participants watch a bunch of videos and then rate them after the experiment. And just to give you an example, we had 157 videos, and here's two examples of one that was later rated by participants as being more familiar, so quite simple, quite boring. And this is an example of a video that was rated as being less familiar. We had a wonderful dancer do this for us, and I think he was wondering what we were on about, but we just said kind of move in strange ways, and he obliged. So in the scanner, what we had our participants do is we had two different tasks, actually, so we could kind of separate out what's specific to motion processing. They were prompted with the task of either to really pay attention to the postures of the dancer or to look at these kind of dots, which is a control condition. Fixation cross, and then the video would last 6 seconds, and as you can see, there was red and green dots that were kind of superimposed over the dancer's body that occurred once every second and a half, and participants' task during the dot task was to remember what the last colored dot was, and their task for the postures task was to, they were shown two different postures after the video ended, and they were to say, okay, which movement should come next? Should his body be like this, or should it be like this, based on what he was just doing? And the dot task, of course, I had to pick which color dot. And again, to get our ratings of familiarity, we had people come back after they were scanned and rate every one of the 157 videos on a 1 to 9 scale of visual familiarity with each movement. Now, this is potentially an interesting point. We didn't test people's ability to kinematically reproduce these movements. We just said, give us a general idea of how visually or familiar these movements are. And again, we have two separate analyses I'm going to focus on today. The first is the univariate GLM, which is, yes, the status quo analysis, but it also is important for giving us the regions of interest to take forward for the multivariate analyses. And we're going to look at the parametric effects of increasing familiarity on perception. And then we're going to do the DCM analyses to test the predictive coding model about these kind of the decreased influence moving forward and the increased influence moving backwards when movements are rated by participants as more familiar. So the first analysis, our univariate analysis, looking at parametric effects of increasing familiarity. Here we see really nice engagement within the left hemisphere of our 3 core nodes of the action observation network. And what's important about this analysis is that we're then able to use these 3 core nodes as our regions of interest to then form our dynamic causal model. And for the dynamic causal modeling, what we first did was we performed a family comparison analysis to determine where inputs go into the system. So is it just the MTG, just the IFG, or both the MTG and IFG? This analysis told us that the inputs are going into the system in both directions. Then we performed Bayesian model selection on the 15 models with input into the IFG and MTG options, and we looked at movement familiarity modulating all the different possibilities, or combination of possibilities of directions between these nodes. And what we found is that our most interconnected model, where movement familiarity modulates all the connections, was the winning model by quite a wide margin. So then we're able to test, okay, how does increasing movement familiarity change the effective connectivity between these main nodes of the action observation network? And that analysis yielded this result. And sometimes it's a little difficult to interpret, but what you see here is that increasing movement familiarity exerts these changes of influence on all the individual connections according to these numbers here, and the bold ones are the ones that are significant and corrected for multiple comparisons. So what we see is that although it's quite subtle, that there's familiarity-related changes in effective connectivity in our data, so we are able to test this dynamic, the predictive coding model. And what we see is that the effect sizes can be interpreted as essentially percentage changes in effective connectivity. So we see essentially that there's a 1% decrease in effective connectivity from MTG to IPL and also from IPL to MTG. So you might be thinking that doesn't sound exactly like what you predicted, and you'd be correct. So our prediction was that we should see a decrease of influence moving forward in our model and an upregulation of influence moving posteriorly in our model. And what we found instead was no real change in the reciprocal connections between IFG and IPL, but instead we get a dampening down of influence bilateral or reciprocally between IPL and MTG. So what we'd like to conclude from this is that there's partial support for a predictive coding model. We get a dampening of influence of our visual region when movements are later rated as increasingly more familiar or more like me. So this bilateral reduction in influence between IPL and MTG, we would say that this is associated with decreased prediction error and therefore a dampening down of the sensory inputs into the system. So not completely clear support for the model, but a very interesting kind of take on how increasing familiarity might be decreasing sensory motor engagement. So what have we learned so far, or what have we learned from these 3 studies I walked you through? Well, we set out to test how an observer's experience, either established through training or general life experience and then validated by ratings afterwards, shapes perception when we're seeing others moving around us in complex ways. And we specifically aimed to explore the general idea of the like-me hypothesis and the more specific predictions that we might be able to draw from the predictive coding account of action observation. And our data overall contradict the simplest conception of the like-me hypothesis, which is the more like me, the more engagement of the AON. And we're able to suggest that there's possibly a nonlinear relationship between these things. And we're also able to say that predictive coding provides possibly clearer and very testable hypotheses for how fluctuations in experience might be manifest through connections between the different nodes of the action observation network. And so far, our DCM data are providing kind of tentative support for this model. That's what we'd say. Now, I'm just going to spend 2 more slides talking about next directions, because I think they're quite interesting. They're really going to allow us to address some of the outstanding questions that our data have presented with us so far. So of course, if we want to more closely look at this question about how experience is going to shape modulation between these core nodes of the action observation network, we need to get back into training studies, and we need to see how learning, the process of learning, is going to shape how information is exchanged between these core nodes. And by tracking how modulation changes across the learning cycle, we might be able to establish much more concretely how objective measures of familiarity or experience really relate to changes in action observation network engagement as well as connectivity. So we're also looking to move beyond simply doing action observation. We want to get the production side in things as well, especially with the training study, because we can have people doing things as well. So to look at both the impact of physical and observational experience while people are in the scanner, we've developed a slightly different approach, moving away from the dancing a little bit, and we've developed a scanner-safe bass guitar that we can have people actually playing the guitar in the scanner. This took a while to develop. If anyone would ever like to use it for their research, we're very happy to share. But the beautiful thing about this guitar is that people can be playing it in the scanner, and we can be recording their behavioral performance while they're trying to perform particular tasks. So there's a little image there. I can't say that you're holding the guitar like this in the scanner. It's slightly more like this. But what we've used is this bespoke scanner-safe guitar along with the Rocksmith video game. So if anyone's tried to learn to play guitar, Rocksmith is a great way to learn in an online way where you get feedback. And we're able to then look at how production and perception of these actions that you're having either physical experience with or observational experience with is going to shape learning. And this just gives you an idea of what people are seeing in the scanner when they're actually trying to play guitar. So a little bit of Ramones here, and they're playing along with the guitar, they're getting kind of their actual actions there as to what they're supposed to be doing. And this just really allows us to have people perform, learn, and also observe other people's actions, and we can start to track how changes are coming online. And these studies are just wrapping up now. They've just been sent out. One was sent out a few months ago, one was sent out a week ago for review. And essentially, this approach is really allowing us to test how, well, two things. It's allowing us to test this U-shaped proposed function, so we're able to look at this from a perception and from a production perspective. And it's also allowing us to look at how changes in experience in quantifiable ways are changing effective connectivity between the core nodes of the action observation network. So I'd like to conclude by thanking all of the fabulous people who've done a lot of the work on this project, in particular Tom Gardner, who was the PhD student doing the DCM studies, and he's finishing up in a week, so he's looking for a postdoc right now if anyone's interested. And for my final slide, I'd like to say that we're also recruiting for a new exciting project, so if you're interested in doing a PhD or a postdoc, please get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Questions? Steve?
It's a great talk. I'm curious about the DCM analysis. If you were to examine the weights for individual subjects, would those predict the individual variability across subjects in terms of how much improvement in behavior they showed? And depending on what you say to that, I have a follow-up question.
Okay, wait, so how much improvement in behavior?
So careful.
Are you talking about the dance observation one or the guitar one?
Just the one
that I showed, the
just before the
observation.
guitar, yeah, where you showed the sort of the three different regions with the changes in the DCM.
I mean, their behavioral performance, it's just how well they're predicting, it's an A or B, it's a binary prediction. I think we could look at that. We've analyzed those data every which way, and we didn't do a ton of stuff. The only thing that we did individual-wise is we have individuals' familiarity ratings, and then accuracy. So we put those into the model, but we don't look at it at a more kind of individual way based on that. But do you think that that could tell us?
Well, I mean, when you come up with your weights, you're not going to be able to get a trial-specific estimate of those weights. So the only way you could really do it is to look across subjects to see whether or not variation in those weight values predicted variation in the behavior across subjects. But so I guess one reaction, I mean, I guess I have mixed feelings about the predictive coding model at some level. So it's a nice, big, sweeping set of ideas.
Yes.
But if you look at what you got, it doesn't actually line up with what you necessarily expected. What you got is sort of symmetric decreases, right?
Yes,
so,
exactly.
At some level, we have to take those predictions seriously if we're going to take the model seriously. So is there an alternative that occurred to you, as opposed to this sort of feed-forward feedback kind of mechanism, that might make sense with regard to the changes in behavior? Like, it looks as if maybe they're becoming more independent or something.
Yes,
right?
yes. So this idea of them becoming more independent is something that we talk a little bit about in the paper, or it's almost like they're kind of decoupling. They're taking the MTG node offline and saying like, okay, we don't really need you as much anymore. You pipe down a little bit, that you're not contributing as much to this prediction. So this is why, I don't know, I found our findings to be really interesting in light of what we predicted, because we had very clear predictions. And our findings are also very clear. We just showed this dampening of influence. So it's certainly not what the predictive coding model, and it's perhaps, as you say, overly simplistic conceptualization would suggest. It has very clear forwards, backwards, and that's what's going to change. But I don't know. I didn't find it as discouraging, on first reading as maybe we should have. But I do think it tells us something interesting about, how the visual node might be changing a little bit based on experience. But again, the thing about DCM, believe me, I have many criticisms with the approach as well, but it's small reductions. You know, it's 1% dampening down. Still, it's reliable. It's something that, you know, we can trust to the extent that you can trust any imaging data. But it is quite striking that it's not what we predicted. You're right.
Lolly, over here.
I'd like to just follow up on this predictive coding notion, if you don't mind. It's not clear to me exactly what you mean, and people use the notion, you know, predictive coding in very many ways. So, would you say, for example, that what you're predicting, how you are interpreting the notion of predictive coding would require you to reactivate the same kind of representation? So how detailed would the representation need to be? How similar to the original would it need to be for it to be predictive coding as opposed to imagining or something different? I'm not sure what that something different would be.
This is really interesting. How similar does it need to be? My hunch is, and my reading of the predictive coding model is that that changes based on experience. So you might, you know, start with a gist of an idea of how, and my guess is that the system implements it in this way, and of course it is very much being shaped by experience. So the first time you see, let's say, someone perform a slam dunk in basketball, you've never seen that before, that might be, you know, quite interesting, and, you know, you might not have strong predictions for it, but the second time you might have a little bit of an idea about what's going to happen in real time, and then by seeing these things again and again, you get clearer and stronger, you know, more detailed, more precise predictions. But I don't think, I wonder what James Kilner would say, but I don't think he would suggest that when you're seeing actions unfold in real time that you have super precise, very detailed templates of how something should unfold. It doesn't make sense for the brain to work that way. Having kind of more gist ideas or gist notions makes much more sense. But I do think that these are very much changing over time, and that's why this U-shaped model might be able to help us to understand when you have kind of a really hazy idea or not much of an idea at all, or prediction at all, not a detailed prediction, and how that starts to kind of be filled in and become richer with experience.
Yeah, and for example, representational similarity analyses, where you generate models, might help you to understand what kind of representations are or are not being activated.
Indeed, we're doing some stuff with that right now. Data's not ready, but yes, exactly.
Sure.
It's a beautiful talk, which I think is entirely attributable to your attending this conference in 2008, where you learned how to give a great lecture. I think I was talking then. No, so anyway, I too have questions about prediction. I think I have two questions. Well, I have probably 30, but I'll ask two. So the first is that for almost all of your talk, I believe your assumptions or notions about predictive coding is that it's happening all the time. But in the first experiment you discussed, I was then confused about, you were contrasting perception versus prediction, and I didn't understand why you thought prediction wasn't happening with the perception, and maybe that was just a labeling thing, but it did get me quite confused.
No, I appreciate that, and I thought about how to make that less confusing. I think various iterations it was only using more words, and that's not necessarily helpful. But you're exactly right. During perception, there is massive amounts of prediction going on. I think in the paper too, because the paper is obviously just one discrete chunk of all of this work, we talk about the differences between prediction versus perception, and prediction is when there's no perception going on. But of course, during perception, prediction is going on as well. But it's simply a labeling thing, and I don't for a moment think that we're not predicting as well during perception.
So I guess, but what I'm left wondering then is what you think the difference is between those conditions. Because you found areas that had more activation in the let's call it no perception versus perception, right?
Yeah.
What do you attribute that activation to then?
So I attribute that activation to the fact that all of a sudden your agent is gone, and you have to kind of ramp up these prediction processes because you're not getting any visual feedback. So during the perception with prediction process, you're getting visual feedback. So the gymnast is moving like this through space, and you're kind of saying like, okay, this is how it's happening. Then all of a sudden she disappears behind the occluder. There's no more perception to kind of aid your predictions, and you're kind of, you have to upregulate the simulation.
But maybe you're doing less prediction. I guess I don't necessarily share that.
Yeah, so when you're doing less prediction, I think maybe if you're sitting here, you know nothing about this, I put this video up, I think that's probably the case, but because our participants in that task were specifically assigned to predict when that person is going to reappear and press a button, like it's a very active, predictions happening on multiple levels here, but it's a very active prediction task. So I think, from a behavioral level, definitely more prediction is happening during that.
Yeah, we might just mean different. This might just be a semantic difference. It seems like they're done having information with which to make the prediction, so now they just have a timing task, right?
Oh, yeah, this is an interesting point, and I didn't show this, but when we're showing the data for prediction without perception versus prediction with perception, we see really, really robust engagement of the cerebellum. So of course we're interpreting this as part of the timing task as well. So you're exactly right, it is a timing task, but maybe you would do that task differently than me, because I feel like when I do that task, and some of our participants reported this, they're thinking about how that agent is moving behind that black occluder, but someone else might be saying like, okay, I know this is going to be about, it took them 1 second to get from there to there, so that's about the same, so one, press. So you're right, you could solve the task in that way.
Okay, and then my second question, which is partly triggered by Aula using the word imagination, which I think also might relate to what's going on with the occluder, is that I was wondering how much anatomical overlap there is between the inferior parietal node of this network and the regions of the angular gyrus that are considered part of the task negative or default mode network, pick your favorite label for it, which some people have described as being involved in imagination. It's been described as being involved in everything, but just anatomically, I wasn't quite clear how much that overlapped with that network.
It's a good question. So I think the network, as you can see, we have big, beautiful, perfect spheres around our regions of interest, and in reality, it's never that clear or clean. We frequently find more anterior, kind of like IPL proper, usually in most of these tasks. However, that's not to say that angular gyrus, it does come up, and I find angular gyrus really interesting because, of course, a lot's going on in angular gyrus. And in terms of its relationship to default mode processing, is that going on as well, imagination? I'm sure, I don't think our data can adjudicate, they can't tell us exactly what's happening with that, but I think it'd be really interesting to get into that in more detail with different tasks. But, as has come up in several talks in this workshop, like, our data, we can only take as much of them as our task will allow us, and I don't think my tasks let me really get at that question.
Angelica and then Brian. Sorry, Brian. I want to move it to the back a bit.
Thanks. So I have a follow-up on the first question that Sharon asked before, so about the difference between the prediction and the perception condition that you found in IPL. If I remember correctly, the beta estimates indicated that the, say, activation was actually quite weak, and what you really saw was that there was quite a, well, you could call it suppression, so the perception condition was really much more negative than the prediction condition. So I'm wondering, is this really an active increase of the prediction or an active suppression of the perception condition, and if so, how would that change your interpretation of those results?
Interesting. So is it a decrease of perception, not an increase of prediction? That's potentially, I don't think that that's necessarily not the case. We interpret it as an uptick in prediction. I don't know. So how would it change our interpretation of the results if it is this uptick? I don't know. I think it might. I think I'd probably want to explore that in more detail with a follow-up study to pull it apart in more detail. I have to say, what's interesting about this task in particular, we thought, like working in Wolfgang Prince's lab, we thought there's a lot of people doing stuff with prediction and timing, and prediction in time and prediction in space, and we thought we were being very clever in a way, coming up with this prediction task where we had agents disappearing, we could have people press buttons when they think that they're going to reappear. But at the same time, this is an incredibly complex task, and I think you're right that this is not terribly straightforward to interpret, because our parameter estimates, I put them up there for transparency, because as you can see, it's a lot of stuff, there's decreases, and we can't interpret the baseline with great conviction. But I think I'd want to follow that up with more studies to really get at that. But do you have any ideas as to how you would change your interpretation?
This is just what you expect from the task negative interpretation.
Yeah, so that's okay. That's the task negative interpretation. So that's interesting, yeah. Like that.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what I thought on that slide.
Yeah, that's interesting. And would you say that as well, Angelica?
So if both studies are actually not that compatible with the predictive coding model, then maybe we have to rethink just an
I definitely
option.
think that part's true,
Yeah.
definitely, yeah. So I think it's a useful point of departure, but yes, our data don't cleanly align, and as much as I would love to have beautiful just so stories that say that we set out to find this and this is exactly what we found beyond any questions, it's always a little bit more complex, and it wiggles around, and it's not helped by the fact that these regions, especially in parietal cortex, but really all three of our AON nodes, are doing lots of different things, not just prediction, not just perception, lots of other imagination, computation things as well.
It's your turn, Brian. Use that time well.
Okay. So moving a little bit off the predictive coding thing into the like me stuff that you did, you showed that the robot causes an increase in activation, which made you predict this U-shaped curve. But that's confusing to me because one of the previous results you showed from other groups shows that as you move to a dog, activation goes way down.
Yep.
And I think you'd be hard pressed to convince me that the dog is more like you than a robot, which is moving in a human-like way and shaped like a human.
Yeah, so this is a good point, and you're picking up on something that sometimes I have to keep it at more of a surface level because it gets complex really fast. We're really making a big distinction with the robot study, the second study, about action. So not as much about agent form. We do look at agent form, and we do see that we get some stronger IPS engagement for a robot versus a human form, but it's really the action element that we talked about, the U-shaped function. So when you look at the dog compared to the monkey compared to the human, that data by Buccino and colleagues, there's form and motion differences across all of those. Whereas we try to really hold constant, at least in that study, form and motion, and then cross those two things, whereas you don't have a human performing dog actions. Whereas I think if you could somehow do that, there's been people who've looked at quadrupedal actions by humans versus quadrupedal animals. So there is a little bit looking into that, but I think you're kind of confounding form and motion together there, and I think the U-shaped curve is simply talking about action, simply talking about the motion parameters, not about the form parameters, because you're exactly right. Like, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that you're going to be making strong predictions about a dog form making, a dog agent making
Can you pass it behind you, Brian?
Thanks for the nice talk. So you can speculate here. I'm curious to know, imagine that this is close to how we understand actions. How do you think this generalizes or applies to the way in which we actually see actions in the environment, which never occurs like one agent in isolation, and so we have all the time and all the resources to do all this, detailed. Most of the time we see, two agents acting together or many, and so.
This is a good question. It's an important point, and I think again, Peter started us off really nicely with some really basic kind of pared down action and perception paradigms. I've taken it up a level, and it seems like, whoa, it's massive. You're seeing gymnasts, you're seeing robots, but you're exactly right. In the real world, we go far more complex. There's multiple agents, multiple actions. We're predicting and kind of interacting in really complex environments. I don't think that this is going to be exactly what it's like in the real world. I think this is a nice, an important step towards that. But no, and we're starting to do stuff now. This is such a paradigm shift, but actually not at all. We're looking at two agents performing together, and they're kind of joint action tasks, but they're more about kind of synchrony and asynchrony and how we coordinate and see and perceive synchrony between other agents. And yeah, as soon as you move to the real world, far, far more complex, you're right. But I think this is a step towards that, but we're very much still kind of distilling out just really simple things. You're right.
2 rows behind. I want to get right to the back of the room.
Thanks. Sort of jumping off of some points that are similar to Sharon and Brian's, I'm wondering to what extent the sort of surprising results about the robot activations in IPL are also due to the heterogeneity of this broad region. For instance, there are tool-selective areas, including areas that respond more to moving tools than moving hands and things like that. And so I'm wondering, if rather than in a single area there's this U-shape, what you're seeing is different areas, some of which respond to similar agents and others responding to tools.
Exactly. So I think that this is an interesting question. I think the form contrast, where we show robotic form versus human form, and we see kind of these occipitotemporal regions extending along the IPS, I think this very much gets on the tool object sort of question. I think they're seeing this funny agent as maybe a mix between some sort of animate form and a tool, or kind of an animated object, which is exactly what it is. And in terms of the action elements of it, the point you're bringing up here is one that I kind of rally against and really think like, oh, how can we get at this in a better way? And yes, MVPA is one way and DCM is another. We're lumping all these regions together. It is a useful point of departure, I will argue. I don't think this is all for naught. And it's like, oh, well, we find the AON, therefore we can say nothing because premotor is doing something different than parietal, is doing something different than occipitotemporal. I completely agree that that's happening, but when we do see these regions acting in concert, I think they can start to tell us something about kind of action perception more generally, but they can't tell us anything via those types of analyses with what each individual region is contributing. So this is just what we're trying to get into right now, is to parse these regions.
And just a mild suggestion would be maybe to functionally localize some of these areas, like the default mode network that was mentioned, tool network, theory of mind networks, that kind of thing might just help you pull apart spatially these other areas.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point. I'd like to ask you, so we can do localizers for all, especially the default mode network. Default mode network is a really interesting one. But my question to you is, if we find that and then see that it overlaps, again, like it can't necessarily tell us that, oh, that region's contributing a default mode network contribution. It's again, these, especially in parietal, these regions are doing lots of different things. Maybe with pattern classification we can pull out within regions. But even then, I'm not really sure.
I wouldn't be surprised if you did a tool localizer, theory of mind localizer, and an action observation network localizer. You would find actually distinguishable regions, certainly at the individual subject level, which you could then probe separately for different effects, and you might find actually different things. I think
we'd find tool and default network separately, but I think AON is going to plop down on top of all. We've done AON localizers before, and it's just. Maybe we need to have more specialized and precise AON localizers, but right now we just get really broad bilateral swaths of premotor, parietal, occipitotemporal, which is useful but not terribly fine grained. So, but it's a really interesting idea.
Across the aisle, then Jerry, then Alfonso.
Thanks for the nice talk. I wanted to go back to the previous discussion about perception versus prediction. And it seems to me that another important difference between the two conditions is also that during the prediction, you're asked to produce a model response, right?
Yeah.
So how much of that could also explain or, let's say, contaminate your effect? Yeah. Namely, like the preparation of the button press.
So we were very careful about that, and what we did is we modeled the prediction event as a zero-timed event. So we take just the moment from when the agent fully disappears beyond the occluder, and we had a really wide range of actions in that study. So the fastest one, the agent was behind the occluder for just less than a second, and the longest one, the agent was behind the occluder for about 14 seconds. So there's a massive variation in how long they're actually behind the occlusion. It kind of ranges everywhere between there. So we just took this as an event with zero duration right when it disappears in an attempt to really kind of model out the motor preparation, which is something that we absolutely take seriously. You're right that it still could be happening for the ones where the things are moving really quite quickly, but we would argue that because there is such variability, and lots of them are 7, 8, 9 seconds behind there, it's slower than the HRF response, and we don't think that that's going to be contaminating those data too much.
Thanks. Yeah, I was asking also because it would seem to be quite compatible also with the regions you find in your results, right? Like, I mean, there seems to be even something in the left hemisphere, like motor cortex. I don't know. Like,
it's not quite.
It just made me think of
that.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
Jerry?
So I'd like to come back to the second series of studies with the robot. And There are a couple of things that are sort of related here. One of them is the form and one of them is the action. And I've been just sort of wrestling with whether I can ask this question and ignore the infant data, which I shall do to begin with, which is, if this is about action, then one might, independently of form, then one might imagine you'd get the same effects if you use point light displays. So you take out the form. Yeah. That then renders a question of what the infants are doing as kind of curious. And one of the things that I thought that is very hard to dissociate here is that you potentially have very slightly unnatural actions, and I wanted to ask just as a methodological point whether, and I thought I saw this in the videos, I thought I saw that you had stop motion for the robot, but you didn't have stop motion for the act.
Yeah.
Right, so that already could introduce something.
Yeah.
But there are two bits of unfamiliarity. One of them is the motion in the robot, and the other is the form of the robot. And those two things are potentially independent. And it could be that what the infant is doing is just mapping one unfamiliar thing onto another unfamiliar thing, just like infants when they're doing verbal labeling. If they've got an unfamiliar label, they're more prone to map that onto an unfamiliar object. I'm just wondering to what extent you can get at this issue of whether the form and the action are bound together, and it's the conjunction of those things that are leading to prediction, say, or not.
I think this is an interesting point, and I think your simplest reading of the infant data, it's one that we talk about in the paper, and different authors on the paper wanted to take it further, but I was much more in favor of the most agnostic reading, which is kind of familiar goes with familiar, unfamiliar goes with unfamiliar. We can't really say more beyond that. I think you're right that if we did use point light walkers or point light robot dancers with our infants, we might be able to, and our adults, pull this question apart in more detail, but as is, I don't think we can have really big, rich interpretations about what's going on. Your point about the form and motion cues kind of being independent to a certain extent, that was an aim, more or less, because they're not perfectly matched. It's not like this is very clearly this form and this agent, and this is this form. They kind of, they can be pulled apart a little bit more independently. But that was intentional, and we also really hemmed and hawed about whether or not we do stop motion cinematography for human actions, but in the end we decided to go with kind of the realism, and the fact that we do get these, when we collapse across for the human versus robotic motion contrasts, each of those include smooth human action and stop motion cinematography robotic action, and we still, I would argue, find quite interesting things, but you're right, there's I'm always interested to talk to people who are also working with these types of stimuli or asking these types of questions, because the trade-offs, I think, are so monumental about what you're going to actually choose to do, and you're going to have all these problems if you go this way, but you're going to have a different set of problems if you go this way. I think in the end we just have to pick a way and be very aware and acknowledge the limitations, but at the same time say, well, with what we have, we can conclude this.
I think appropriately, the last question will be from Alfonso.
No, Emily, I'm not going to ask you a question about the research. I want to ask a question about your introduction, if I may. You gave this very upbeat presentation about all this wonderful evidence, supposedly, for this resonance theory. Some people have argued that the evidence for resonance theory is compatible with an alternative theory that doesn't involve resonance. And those people have also presented data that is incompatible with resonance theory. So where do we stand? I mean, why are you so upbeat about a theory that seems to have lots of evidence against it?
I think the resonance theory, I like it, Alfonso, because it's something that people, I think, get. It's something that has a lot of intuitive appeal. But at the same time, like many theories, at the start of many theories, it is perhaps oversimplified, or once you scratch beneath the surface, it's a heck of a lot more complicated. I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. I think the resonance theory, it has a nice historical background. It's a nice point of departure, but I agree, you and others have shown that there's other explanations and interpretations of a lot of these data, and yes, we find data that very much kind of fly in the face of it, but I don't think that that's a reason to say that it's got it all wrong.
Well, actually, what I was referring to was evidence that is incompatible with the theory. Okay. There's evidence showing, for example, work by Van der Schoor, among others, that if you take individuals without limbs, upper limbs, they show all of the signature effects that people have attributed to simulation theory. So that is existence proof that that theory is at the very least unsupported by evidence, because those data can be explained by a theory that doesn't require simulation. So it's not just a matter of the theory is simple and therefore we should stick with it. I think this theory is simple and therefore we should reject it because it doesn't have much content.
So what would you propose as an alternative?
Yes, I think that the literature is full of theories that show how perception actually encodes all of these things that are important for action. The perception system is a very smart system and has encoded all of the motor stuff. It doesn't mean that you have to go to the motor system to get the information. It's already in the visual system. It could be a wrong theory, right? I'm not saying it's the right theory, but it's not that there isn't an alternative. There's an alternative. And the question is, what evidence do we have that allows us to choose one over the other? Yeah. The evidence that has been cited in support of simulation is compatible with alternative. Yeah. There's evidence that isn't compatible with the theory, and it's not being discussed. Yeah. And so it sort of shows, again, this sort of thing that we do in our field, where we have theories and we like them so much that we forget to look at other data.
I will look at other theories, Alfonso. Thank you. Yes, of course. Thank you.
Well, on that note. Before ending the session, I want to say a few words. I want to say that this has been an incredible 10 years of chaos. It has been a time over which we've had nearly 100 speakers. If you look at the numbers that have been coming, it's quite amazing. And we've never been disappointed. It's been a wonderful year, year after year. We've had absolutely stunning talks, and this year has been no exception. And so I want to thank all of the speakers that are here, some of whom were former speakers who are in the audience, and speakers across the sea who are not with us today. I mean, they are still alive. But they're not here, sadly. So it's been an absolutely amazing journey. I never thought when Alfonso and I began to talk in 2005 at a meeting about the possibility of doing this, and then Brad and Alex and I were brought aboard, and then latterly Marius and Sharon. We never thought it would last and go on with such vigor and such excitement. And I think a lot of that it comes out of not just the speakers, but also the audience who religiously come here and have asked penetrating questions and kept, I think, a level of intellectual discourse that's been really quite amazing. So I just want to once more express how grateful the committee is for the help we've received from all of you in making this such a wonderful occasion. I think Jerry has to say something.
So I just wanted to end so that Sharon didn't have the last word. So the committee have spent a lot of time thanking the speakers and thanking us, and I thought it was about time that we thank the committee. And also, let's not forget the people who've been supporting the IT and running around with the microphones, but primarily we have to thank the committee and their wisdom in choosing fantastic speakers, a fantastic location, and generally giving us all an excuse to have great ice cream, great intellectual debate, and sadly too much wine. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll see you all next year.